November 12, 1944, 8:50 a.m. The Toms Fjord, northern Norway. Captain Robert Weber stood on the bridge of the battleship Tirpitz, watching the horizon. The morning was cold and clear. The mountains around the fjord rose like walls of black rock against the pale Arctic sky. Below his boots lay 52,600 tons of German engineering, the heaviest battleship ever built by a European navy. He was searching for ships. He was preparing for a naval battle. He looked at the 12-inch thick steel armor of his citadel and felt invincible. He had the math to prove it. No torpedo could penetrate his nets. No standard bomb could pierce his deck. 3 rows of anti-torpedo nets surrounded his ship like a steel cocoon. Chemical smoke generators stood ready on the cliffs above, manned 24 hours a day. But Captain Weber was making a fatal error. He didn't realize that the rules of warfare had already changed. He was watching the sea, but the threat wasn't coming from the horizon. Something was coming for him that ignored the rules of naval combat entirely. Something that no amount of armor, no thickness of steel, no depth of water could protect against. To Winston Churchill, the Tirpitz was simply the beast. Churchill didn't just want her sunk. He was obsessed. For 3 years, he had written memo after memo to the Admiralty with a single instruction. The destruction of this ship is the greatest event at sea at this time. No other target is comparable. Why such obsession for a ship that rarely left port? Because the Tirpitz was winning the war without firing a shot. She was what naval strategists called a fleet in being. Just by sitting in her Norwegian lair, she forced the British to keep 2 modern battleships and a fleet carrier permanently stationed in Scotland, paralyzed, waiting for a sortie that might never come. Every convoy sailing to Russia had to be heavily escorted, bleeding the Royal Navy dry. Merchant ships were lost. Sailors drowned in the freezing Arctic waters. And through it all, the Tirpitz sat in her fjord, consuming Allied resources by her mere existence. She was a strategic black hole. Captain Weber understood this power. He felt secure, and he had every reason to. The fjord was a geographic fortress designed to break the rules of naval warfare. The mountains around the anchorage rose steeply to 3,000 feet on all sides. This made a conventional torpedo attack impossible. Planes couldn't drop low enough or fast enough to release their weapons before slamming into the rock walls. The water around the ship was a maze of defenses. 3 rows of heavy anti-torpedo steel nets surrounded the hull, each net weighted with chains and anchored to the seabed. Any torpedo that somehow made it into the fjord would snag in the mesh long before reaching the ship. And on the cliffs above, chemical smoke generators were manned around the clock. German protocol was strict and well-rehearsed. Within 7 minutes of a radar alert, the generators would pump out enough chlorosulfonic acid smoke to blanket the entire fjord in an impenetrable white fog. If you can't see the ship, you can't hit the ship. But the real defense was the armor itself. The Bismarck-class design prioritized survivability above all else. Her citadel, the armored box protecting the engines and magazines, was encased in the finest armor plate German metallurgy could produce. The main belt was over 12 inches thick. The deck armor could shrug off anything dropped from high altitude. To the German crew, the Tirpitz wasn't just a home. It was an iron guarantee of survival. To understand why the final attack changed warfare, you have to survive the failures first. September 1943. Operation Source. The British Admiralty realized they couldn't hit the Tirpitz from the air. The flak was too heavy, the smoke too quick, the fjord too narrow. So they decided to go underneath. They built the X-Craft. These were submarines barely 50 feet long and 5 feet in diameter. They weren't just small, they were steel coffins. Inside, the 4-man crew lived in a space where they couldn't stand up, couldn't stretch out, couldn't escape the smell of diesel fuel, human sweat, and rotting food. The air recycling system was primitive. After 24 hours submerged, the men would be breathing their own exhaled carbon dioxide, their minds growing foggy, their judgment impaired. The mission was insane by any rational standard. The X-Craft had to be towed 1,000 miles across the stormy North Sea by larger submarines, then detach, navigate through minefields, cut through 3 layers of steel nets, and dropped 2 tons of amytal explosive directly under the Tirpitz's keel. The chances of success were calculated at less than 10%. The chances of the crews surviving were even lower. 6 X-craft left Scotland. X-9 broke her tow rope during a storm and vanished into the abyss with all 4 hands. No distress signal, no wreckage, just gone. X-8 developed catastrophic leaks and had to be scuttled by her own crew, who were rescued half dead from hypothermia. Only 3 boats made it to the target. Lieutenant Donald Cameron commanded X-6. He was 23 years old. By the time he reached the outer fjord, his periscope was smashed. His gyro compass had failed. His depth gauge was unreliable. He was navigating blind inside enemy waters, using nothing but dead reckoning and the occasional glimpse through a cracked lens. At 7:07 a.m. on September 22nd, he bumped into something hard. He raised what remained of his periscope and saw he was so close to the Tirpitz that he was looking up at German sailors on deck, throwing their breakfast scraps into the water. He had penetrated the innermost net. Then the engine died. The X-6 surfaced right next to the battleship. German sailors spotted the strange vessel and opened fire with rifles and grenades. Cameron didn't panic. He knew he was going to die or be captured. He put the submarine into a final dive, crashing it onto the seabed directly under the Tirpitz's main turret, Caesar. He set the timer on his 2 side charges, 1 hour. Then he opened the hatches, scuttled the boat, and surrendered. For 60 minutes, Cameron and his crew sat as prisoners on the deck of the Tirpitz, checking their watches. The German officers interrogated them, demanding to know what they had done. Cameron said nothing. He just watched the second-hand move. At 8:12 a.m., the water under the ship erupted. The explosion was massive. It heaved the 52,000-ton battleship 5 feet into the air. Men were thrown off their feet. The lights went out. The massive 15-inch gun turrets, each weighing over 1,000 tons, were jolted off their roller paths. Electrical systems shorted. The ship took on 1,400 tons of water through ruptured seams. It was a brilliant tactical success. Cameron would receive the Victoria Cross. But the Tirpitz didn't sink. The double bottom held. The armored citadel remained intact. German damage control teams, working in freezing water up to their waists, managed to shore up the bulkheads and stop the flooding. Within 6 months, the beast was repaired and operational again. The lesson was bitter. Conventional explosives, even 2 tons of them detonated at point-blank range, could not break German engineering. Back on the bridge, Weber read the damage report. The explosion had lifted 50,000 tons of steel 5 feet into the air. It had shattered delicate instruments, knocked out electrical systems, and killed several men below decks. The repair bill would be enormous. The ship would be out of action for months. But the hull was intact. Weber allowed himself a cold smile. He had felt the explosion through the deck plates. He had seen the chaos, heard the screaming of his men. And yet here he stood on a ship that was still floating, still armed, still dangerous. If 2 tons of explosives detonated directly under the keel couldn't sink the Tirpitz, what could? To him, this wasn't a near-death experience. It was proof. Proof that German engineering was superior to British courage. Proof that the Tirpitz was exactly what her designers had promised. Unsinkable. April 1944. The Tirpitz was operational again. The threat had returned. The Royal Navy decided to stop being subtle. They chose brute force. Operation Tungsten was D-Day scale for a single ship. 2 fleet carriers, HMS Victorious and HMS Furious. 4 escort carriers, cruisers, destroyers. They assembled a strike force of 42 Ferry Barracuda dive bombers escorted by 80 fighters. It was a swarm designed to overwhelm every defense. At dawn on April 3rd, they caught the Germans sleeping. The smoke generators were late. The fjord was clear. The Barracudas screamed down in near-vertical dives, releasing their bombs at the last possible moment. 1 hit, 2 hits, 5 hits. In total, 15 bombs slammed into the Tirpitz in less than 60 seconds. Pilots reported seeing their weapons strike home, seeing the flashes, seeing the smoke rising from the wounded ship. The scene on the deck was a slaughterhouse. The bombs shredded the unarmored upper works. The bridge superstructure was turned into twisted metal. Anti-aircraft crews were wiped out at their stations. 122 German sailors were killed instantly. Over 300 were wounded. From the air, it looked like total victory. But when the reconnaissance photos came back, the British analysts felt their stomachs drop. The Tirpitz was still floating perfectly level. Not a single degree of list. Why? Physics. The Barracudas were carrying 1,600-pound armor-piercing bombs, serious weapons designed to penetrate warship decks. But because of the low cloud ceiling over the fjord, they had to drop from below 3,000 feet. A bomb needs altitude to build velocity. Dropped from that height, the weapons hit the deck at only 500 miles per hour. That wasn't fast enough. They struck the main armored deck, 4 inches of hardened steel, and simply disintegrated. Some bounced off. Others detonated on impact, spraying fragments that killed men but couldn't penetrate the citadel below. They destroyed radar arrays, wrecked the galley, turned the sick bay into a charnel house. But they didn't touch the engines. They didn't touch the magazines. They didn't touch anything that mattered. The beast had shrugged off 15 direct hits like they were hail. Weber walked through the smoke of his burning ship. The smell was overwhelming. Cordite, burning paint, and something worse. He stepped over bodies, past weeping wounded, through compartments that had become abattoirs. 122 of his men were dead. The upper decks looked like they had been hit by an earthquake. But as he made his way down to the main armored deck, he saw the truth. The British bombs had scarred the steel. Some of the welds had cracked. There were dents and gouges where the weapons had struck. But they hadn't penetrated. Not one bomb had made it through to the machinery spaces below. Not one engine was damaged. Not one boiler was ruptured. The magazines were dry and intact. The heart of the beast was still beating. He signaled Berlin. Ship operational. Repairs underway. Standing in the smoke and chaos, Weber felt something strange. Not fear, but confirmation. The Allies had thrown everything they had at him. Submarines, dive bombers, massed air attacks. And he was still here. He was more convinced than ever. They could scratch the paint. They could kill his men. But they couldn't kill his ship. The Admiralty was out of ideas. The Navy had failed. The conventional Air Force had failed. It was time to call in the mad scientists. Enter Barnes Wallis. He wasn't a military man. He was an engineer. The genius who had designed the bouncing bombs used by the Dambusters to destroy the Ruhr dams. He looked at the Tirpitz not as a ship to be sunk, but as a physics problem to be solved. And his solution was radical. His theory was simple. If you can't break the armor from above, destroy the world underneath it. Water and soil are incompressible. If you detonate a massive explosive charge deep underground or underwater, the shock wave travels faster and hits harder than through air. It creates what engineers call a camouflet, a massive vacuum bubble that expands outward and then collapses inward. When it collapses, it removes the foundation. The target doesn't just break, it falls into a hole that wasn't there a second ago. To achieve this, Wallis built a monster. He called it the Tallboy. This was not a normal bomb. It was a handcrafted instrument of geological violence. Length, 21 feet. Weight, 12,000 pounds, nearly 6 tons. Most bombs of the era were cast iron casings filled with cheap explosive. The Tallboy was different. Its casing was a single piece of high-tensile steel, machined to the same precision tolerances as a naval gun barrel. Why? Because it had to survive hitting the ground at Mach 1, 750 miles per hour, without shattering. A normal bomb would disintegrate on impact. The Tallboy was designed to bury itself 30 feet into the earth before detonating. The explosive inside was Torpex, 50% more powerful than TNT. But you couldn't just pour it in. If there were air bubbles in the explosive mixture, the shock of impact would detonate the bomb prematurely before it could penetrate. So the factories filled the Tallboys upside down, pouring the molten explosive drop by drop over several days, allowing each layer to settle and cure before adding the next. Each bomb took weeks to manufacture. And the tail was the secret. The fins were angled precisely 5 degrees off axis. This forced the bomb to spin as it fell, like a rifle bullet leaving the barrel. A standard bomb wobbles, drifts, goes off course. The Tallboy drilled through the air with gyroscopic stability. Drop it from 18,000 feet, and it would land within a tennis court of the aiming point. The British had built the hammer. Now they needed someone crazy enough to swing it. September 1944. Operation Paravane. The Tirpitz had been moved to Kofjord in the far north of Norway, beyond the Arctic Circle. It was too far for a Lancaster carrying a 6-ton bomb to fly from England and return. The math didn't work. So the RAF made a decision that terrified the crews more than the Germans ever could. We will fly to Russia. The elite No. 9 and No. 6 117 squadrons, the legendary Dambusters, took off with 38 Lancasters, each carrying a single Tallboy. They weren't flying to a modern airbase with concrete runways and proper facilities. They were flying to Yagodnik, a muddy strip of grass near Archangel in the Soviet Union. The flight was a disaster of navigation. The maps were wrong. Soviet cartography was decades out of date. The radios were useless in the magnetic interference of the Arctic. They flew through freezing rain that coated the wings in ice, forcing pilots to climb and dive repeatedly to shake it off. 6 planes were forced to crash land in the Russian taiga. Their crews wandered lost in the swamps for days before being found by Soviet patrols. When the survivors arrived at Yagodnik, they found a primitive nightmare. The mud was so deep that the bombers sank to their axles. The Soviet fuel trucks were hand-pumped and the fuel was contaminated. The food was unidentifiable. The latrines were holes in the ground. But they were within range. On September 15th, they attacked. Weber's smoke generators worked perfectly. Within minutes, the fjord vanished under a blanket of white chemical fog. The British bombardiers were dropping blind, guessing where the ship might be based on the pattern of flak bursts rising through the smoke. Most bombs missed by hundreds of yards, but one Tallboy found its mark. It didn't hit the deck. It hit the water near the bow and kept going. The bomb dove underwater, curved beneath the hull, and detonated against the seabed. The shock wave was catastrophic. It whipped the entire 52,000-ton ship like a bedsheet snapping in the wind. The bow was crushed, bulkheads ruptured. The massive propeller shafts were knocked completely off their mountings. The Tirpitz didn't sink, but she was broken. Her engines were destroyed. She would never sail under her own power again. The Germans made a fatal calculation. Berlin decided to tow the crippled battleship south to Tromsø. The reasoning seemed sound. Use her as a static floating battery, her massive 15-inch guns providing coastal defense against any Allied landing in Norway. She couldn't sail, but she could still fight. They dredged a sandbank under her keel. The logic was straightforward. Even if she sank, she would simply settle onto the sandbank and keep firing. The water was shallow enough that her decks would remain above the surface. They thought they were making her unsinkable by definition. Weber told his officers, "We are no longer a ship. We are an unsinkable steel fortress. We cannot sink because we are already on the bottom." He believed it. After everything, the submarines, the dive bombers, the Tallboys, he was still alive and his ship was still dangerous. The laws of physics seemed to be on his side. He didn't know he had just parked his ship on top of a geological trap. And he didn't know that by moving south, he had brought the Tirpitz 200 miles closer to Scotland. He had shortened the distance just enough. The victim had walked into the executioner's range. November 12, 1944. Operation Catechism. This was the end. No more Russia. The target was now within range of Scotland. Barely. But to carry 12,000 pounds of bomb that distance, the Lancasters had to be stripped to the bone. The mechanics removed the mid-upper gun turrets. They removed the armor plating that protected the crew. They removed the de-icing equipment that kept the wings from icing over at altitude. These weren't warplanes anymore. They were flying fuel tanks with a massive bomb strapped underneath. If a German fighter found them, they were dead. If the weather turned bad, they were dead. The crews knew the odds. They climbed aboard anyway. 32 Lancasters took off at 3 a.m. into the freezing darkness. At 8:00 a.m., German radar picked up the incoming formation. The alarm screamed across the Tirpitz. "Smoke! Make smoke!" This had saved them every time before. The crews raced to the generators. Valves were opened. The acid began to pump into the burners. White smoke started to rise from the cliffs around the fjord. But nature decided to intervene. There was no wind. Not a breath of air moved across the water. The smoke didn't spread. It just hung in place. A low white blanket that covered the water, but left the masts and superstructure of the Tirpitz sticking out above it like a target marker. At 14,000 feet, the lead bombardier looked through his SAB sight, the stabilized automatic bomb sight, an analog computer of gears and lenses that calculated wind drift, altitude, and terminal velocity. Below him, through breaks in the smoke, he could see the black shape of the battleship. The aiming point was clear. The German 15-inch guns opened fire. They weren't shooting at ships. They were firing main battery shells fused for altitude, trying to knock the bombers out of the sky with blast effects. The sky around the Lancasters filled with black explosions. The aircraft bucked and shuddered in the turbulence, but the pilots of 617 Squadron flew straight and level. They called it the dead man's run. For the final 60 seconds of a bomb run, you cannot deviate. You cannot dodge. You cannot flinch. You must fly perfectly straight to let the mathematics work. Bomb gone. Then silence. A Tallboy takes nearly 30 seconds to fall from that height. 30 seconds of watching, waiting, hoping. 8:41 a.m. The first Tallboy missed the ship by 30 feet, but it hit the sandbank directly alongside. This is where Weber's plan died. The earthquake effect did exactly what Barnes-Wallis had designed it to do. The bomb buried itself deep in the sand and detonated. The seabed itself became a weapon. A second Tallboy struck the ship amidships. It punched through the upper deck, through the armored deck below, and kept going. It tore through the ship from top to bottom before exiting through the hull and detonating in the water on the far side. The Tirpitz had been skewered. A third Tallboy hit near the port side. It opened the hull like a can opener. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the Tirpitz began to roll. Slowly at first. Men scrambled across the tilting deck. Weber gripped the rail of his bridge as the world tilted beneath him. The ship that had survived submarines, mines, and 15 direct bomb hits was finally dying. The roll accelerated. The massive turrets, each weighing as much as a destroyer, tore loose from their mountings and crashed into the sea. The ship turned over like a dying whale. When she reached 135 degrees, the sound came, a deep, rumbling roar as thousands of tons of equipment, ammunition, and machinery tore free and smashed into the port side of the hull. The Tirpitz had completely capsized. Captain Weber went into the water with his ship. He was one of the lucky ones. He was pulled from the freezing sea by a German patrol boat, alive. Behind him, the Tirpitz lay upside down in the shallow water, her keel pointing at the pale Arctic sky. Over 1,000 of his men were still inside, trapped in the upturned hull, entombed in the steel fortress that had promised them safety. The beast was dead. What sank the Tirpitz wasn't a lucky shot. It wasn't a massive explosion. It was an idea. Barnes-Wallis understood that the real target wasn't the ship. It was the world the ship depended on. The water, the seabed, the assumptions that made Captain Weber feel safe. The Tirpitz was designed to withstand any attack from the sea or sky, but it couldn't withstand an attack on reality itself. Captain Weber survived. He spent the rest of the war as a prisoner and the rest of his life haunted by the sound of a ship tearing itself apart. He had believed in German engineering. He had believed in armor thickness and steel quality and unsinkable fortresses. He had believed that if you built something strong enough, it would last forever. He was wrong. There is no fortress that cannot be undermined. No armor that cannot be outthought. No invincible weapon that cannot be rendered obsolete by a man with a blackboard and a crazy idea. The Tirpitz rests today in Tromsø Fjord, upside down in 40 feet of water. Her hull is still there, a massive steel tomb for the men who trusted her. Tour boats pass over her on calm summer days. Sometimes, when the light is right, you can see her shape beneath the surface, a shadow of the beast that once ruled the Arctic Sea. She was the largest, most powerful, most heavily armored battleship ever built by a European navy. And she was sunk not by a bigger ship or a bigger gun, but by a bomb that was designed to change the rules. The Tallboy didn't just break the Tirpitz. It broke the idea that any weapon could be invincible. It proved that in the end, the only real armor is the ability to adapt. And the Tirpitz, for all her steel and all her might, could not adapt. She just sat in her fjord, waiting for the world to change around her. And when it did, she died.